Good morning or good afternoon, thanks to British Summertime, and welcome to the Japan Society's regular webinar on current affairs and business. I am Bill Emmott, and as many of you know, I have the honor and pleasure of chairing the Japan Society. Thank you all for your support of the Japan Society and of all its online events. This week, our topic is perhaps the most fundamental political and economic issue of our era: the relationship between the world's two superpowers, the United States and China, and the implications of that developing relationship for the rest of us, notably, of course, Japan, but also the UK. There has often been talk, as tensions have grown in recent years between the US and China, of a new Cold War. But there is a vital difference between the old relationship between the Soviet Union and the USA and that between the US and China. It is that while in the Cold War, the world, and especially Europe, was divided into two quite separate spheres with fairly limited commercial and people-to-people interchange between them, in the modern era of US-China rivalry, we are all deeply and often intimately interacting with one another. These are, after all, the two largest economies in the world and are the world's top two exporters of goods and services. In the UK alone in 2018 to 19, fully 1/4 of all the foreign students studying here were Chinese, 120,000 out of 485,000 international students in all. And the UK is an advanced example of what's happening in many, particularly English-speaking countries. While during the Cold War, there were fairly clear political and security alliances on both sides of the divide, now between the US and China, the alliances and relationships feel far more fluid. Certainly in Asia, pretty much all countries feel a need to have a good relationship with both. The idea of having to choose sides would horrify most governments in the region. Now, however, looking in both directions is becoming harder on many fronts: technology, health, commerce, human rights, Hong Kong, defense, the South China Sea, and more. The Trump administration chose to fight a trade war with China, the tariffs from which remain in place, yet also saw politically many issues on which it wished to collaborate with China, most notably North Korea. Decoupling technologies and altering supply chains are the talk of the commercial day, yet actually investment into China remains important for many firms. For example, 2 weeks ago, Fanuc, Japan's leading robot maker, announced its biggest investment in China to date. And in political and media affairs, tensions are rising. Yesterday, the BBC correspondent in China had to leave the country to base himself in Taiwan. And just last week, China, the European Union, the US, and Canada exchanged a round of mutual sanctions and insults over issues of human rights and democracy in Hong Kong. So where do we go from here? What course will the Biden administration follow? How should Japan, the UK, and Europe respond? To answer these and other questions, I'm delighted to welcome two speakers from the US and Japan, from quite different generations of scholarship and deep engagement with the issue. From Washington, DC, I welcome my old friend Clyde Prestowitz, who took part, in fact, in the first US trade mission to China back in 1982. Clyde became well known to many of us for his role in trade negotiations with Japan later in that decade, and for his 1990 book, Trading Places, about the then US-Japan rivalry. Now president of the Economic Strategy Institute in Washington, DC, this veteran observer of the Asian commercial and political scene has turned his attention now to China with a new book, The World Turned Upside Down: America, China, and the Struggle for Global Leadership. And I heartily recommend it. And just returned to London from Tokyo is our second speaker, Yuka Koshino, who is Research Fellow for Japanese Security and Defense Policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Full disclosure, another honor that I hold is as chair of the IISS. Yuka has also worked in Washington with the CSIS, in some ways the US equivalent of IISS, and in Tokyo with the Asia-Pacific Initiative, the think tank chaired by our speaker at our previous webinar, Yoichi Funabashi. Now, as usual, I'm going to ask our speakers to give us opening remarks of 10 minutes each on these issues, followed by discussion and, crucially, your questions. I'm going to start with Clyde Prestowitz from Washington, D.C. Clyde, welcome to the Japan Society. Over to you.
So nice to be with you. Let me say konnichiwa, and good to be with Bill, old friend Bill, and with Yuka-san. So as Bill said, in 1982, while I was involved deeply in trade negotiations with Japan, I also was on the first U.S. trade mission to China. And I have to say it was a shocking experience because I arrived in a China that was completely economically undeveloped. I remember the motorcade we had from the airport into downtown Beijing. There was not a vehicle on the road. There were no stoplights in Beijing. Tallest building was 10 stories high. I woke up early the next morning to go for a jog and almost got run over by waves of people wearing black Mao suits and riding black bicycles. And it really was a very interesting but different impression. I think that the U.S.-China relationship has evolved in about three stages. The first stage, let's say from 1982 until Tiananmen Square, so 82 until June of 1989, was one in which American industry was interested in getting into China. The U.S. government was promoting ties with China in the wake, of course, of normalization of relations in 1979. There weren't really any trade frictions or conflicts. It was just a matter of getting people established, getting American business established in China, and a lot of transfer of technology, but pretty basic technology at the time because China's economy was pretty basic. Then, of course, we had the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989. And at that moment, I think President George H.W. Bush, for whom I also worked for a while, made a really fundamental decision that set the terms of the relationship going forward. He immediately sent his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, to Beijing to meet with Deng Xiaoping. And the message was, this is obviously a big hiccup, but I, George Bush, will keep the boats from rocking too much. And Scowcroft added to that, personally to Deng, saying that right now, George Bush is your best friend in the world. And what that did was kind of put the seal of approval back on China. The incident had, of course, raised a lot of concern on the part of all kinds of people, diplomats, businessmen, about where China was going. And essentially, Bush told the world, it's okay, it's a hiccup, it's not a major thing. And the result was that there was a rush of, within 2 years, there was a rush of investment into China. And China became, between, I would say, 1992 and 2001, it became kind of like the old American Wild West. It was very open, kind of anything went. There was a lot of corruption, but an enormous amount of economic development. Companies from all over the world, Japan, the US, UK, EU, were beginning to make money, and they could see a kind of an El Dorado, because here's this huge country with 1.4 billion people, and it's going to be a much richer country. Then we ran, toward the end of that period, there began to be difficulties because China was not a member of the GATT and had not been a member of the World Trade Organization. And every year, the US Congress was required to vote on whether or not to continue extending most favored nation treatment to China. And as the Chinese economy became bigger and as more and more companies were involved, that vote became very important. And it became a retardant on investment in China because it represented risk. If the Congress, for whatever reason, would not renew the MFN treatment, then all of the basis of the arrangements, the economic arrangements with China, would have been thrown into question. So to get around that, pressure began to build to make China into a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to normalize the trading relationship with China as with the rest of the world. And in the course of that negotiation, the US government, of course, had to persuade the Congress to agree to bring China into the World Trade Organization. And so a lot of studies were done of what would be the impact if China were in the World Trade Organization. And one of the big studies concluded that the US trade deficit with China, which at that time was about $80 billion annually, would be cut in half. The reason being that US already had very low tariffs, China's were high. And so the argument was made. I remember Charlene Barshevsky was then the US trade representative. I testified with her before the Congress. I remember her telling the Congress, listen, Congress, China has high tariffs. We have low tariffs. If we bring China into the WTO, we're not going to have to change anything. The Chinese are going to have to reduce their tariffs, and that will stimulate American exports to China, and the trade deficit will be cut in half. And so China was brought into the WTO. And then a very familiar pattern began to evolve. I say familiar because I was one of the main players in the US-Japan trade frictions, the Boeki Masatsu of the 1980s. That was characterized by a fundamental, I think, misunderstanding, which was the following. In the case of Japan, in the 1980s, US companies would come into the Commerce Department and they would say, oh, we have all these troubles in Japan. The Japanese don't play fair. It's closed. There are all these relationships that are impossible to get behind. And they have an industrial policy. And they're cheating. They're bad guys. Then we would go to the Japanese. We would say to people at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and at MITI, we would say, listen, come on, you guys, you have to play by the rules. You have to open up. And our Japanese counterparts would say, what are you talking about? Listen, they would say, hey, the problem isn't us, it's your businessmen. Your businessmen don't try hard enough. Their delivery is always late. Their quality, I mean, come on. They put the steering wheel on the wrong side of the car. I mean, how can you expect us to buy? And so it was kind of a Mexican standoff. Well, that same pattern began to evolve with China. And increasing complaints about Chinese industrial policy, hidden barriers. But there were some early, I think, indications of where, an evolution that has brought us to where we are now. So go back to 1997, and China began to erect what we call the Great Firewall, to separate the Chinese internet from the rest of the world internet. In fact, you could even go back to 1993 when China began to build its own GPS global positioning system. In Europe, you have the Galileo system. And the Galileo system and the US GPS were perfectly open to China, but the Chinese said, no, we're going to do our own in 1993. Then 1997, they begin building the Great Firewall. And while they welcome investment by many foreign and Japanese companies, they do not allow Microsoft or Google or Facebook or Yahoo any entry into the Chinese market. Then in 2005 came a 5-year plan, which heralded what we now know as Made in China 2025. But in 2005, the 5-year plan identified a number of what we would call target industries that China put together a 5-year plan to aim to develop. And then, of course, in 2015, China announced Made in China 2025, identifying a number of high-tech industries as industries in which China would become self-sufficient or largely self-sufficient by 2025. And that period between, let's say, 2000 and 2015 had been characterized by increasing complaints that China was not really abiding by its WTO commitments, and increasing complaints about hidden barriers. And of course, in the case of China, because there's no rule of law, there are a lot of ways in which corporations and individuals can be coerced without public discussion. Then we come to 2018, and Bill's former Bill, as you all know, was editor of The Economist. In February 2018, I received a call from a publisher asking me if I would be interested to write a book about U.S. and China. And my publisher said, Clyde, you have a reputation for being outside the box, and we need an outside the box book. So if I looked at the box in 2018, I realized that my own views were certainly outside the box. But on March 1st, 2018, The Economist cover story says the West made the wrong bet on China, and the box began to shift. And that set the stage for what we have seen developing over the last 6 years, which is an increasing tension and an increasing conflict between the US and China, but not just the US and China, between China and a large part of the free world. I want to close with a final point, which is that the relationship right now, and I think looking back, it has been this way for a long time, but it wasn't fully realized, has really two fundamental aspects. One of them is economic, and economically, China and the US and much of the rest of the world are coupled. But at the same time, it's not just about economics. It's about fundamental ideological differences. China, in Article 9 of the Party Congress in 2013, specifically said China is opposed to Western-style constitutional democracy. It's opposed to universal values. It's opposed to freedom of speech. It's opposed to what we in the free world think of as an open democratic society. And China has increasingly begun to use the dependence, the economic dependence of other countries to discipline them. And so we see the Prime Minister of Australia calls for an investigation of the COVID, the origin of COVID, and suddenly Australian exports to China dive. Korea, the US builds a radar station in Korea, and suddenly Latte's business in China dries up. Norway gives a Nobel Prize to Liu Xiaobo, and suddenly exports of Norwegian salmon dry on the dock in China. And I think this is an aspect that has become very unsettling. And particularly, we now see China reorganizing and cracking down on Hong Kong. I have a good friend in Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai, who is the head of the only independent newspaper, was the only independent newspaper in Hong Kong, the Apple. Jimmy's going to go to jail. And he's going to go to jail because he believes in free speech. And so I think that tension poses an increasingly difficult barrier to the kind of movement toward what Bob Zoellick, the former Deputy Secretary of State, kept talking about. We want China to be a responsible stakeholder in the liberal global rules-based order. It's increasingly clear to me that China doesn't want to be a stakeholder in that order, and that we in the West, in the free world, are going to have to find a way to re-establish a relationship with China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clyde. I mean, one thing I should have said that I've always agreed with Clyde up very much is that with Japan in the 80s and now with China, he doesn't think that the purpose of negotiation should be to try to change the other party. It should be to try to understand the other party and respond accordingly. I think that's what he's done for us now, to help us understand how China's evolved and how the relationship's evolved. Now, Yuka Koshino, how does this look from a Japanese point of view and Japanese economic and strategic statecraft? How do you navigate these turbulent waters?
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and it is my honor and pleasure today to speak and join this conversation. So I guess in my opening remarks, I would like to set the context of Japan's strategic thinking in both in security and economics by kind of highlighting three different categories. So one is how the rise of China that Clyde just explained has impacted Japan's thinking. And then also how that has changed under the Trump administration, and then how that might change under the Biden administration. So first, so I think we heard a lot about great detail and comprehensively from Clyde about China's pursuit of what I think we call it the double IISS, China's use of geo-economic power, China's ability to kind of exploit its dependence, other countries' dependence to China on economic and trade terms to achieve its own strategic and political goals. So Japan has always, looking back a decade ago, I would start by saying that Japan had always been quite sensitive to China's use of such power. Due to the geographical proximity. The first trigger for Japan was really the 2010 when there was a Senkaku boat collision incident between the Japanese Coast Guards and the Chinese trawlers. And when the Japanese government detained the Chinese crew members, China responded by halting the rare earth exports to Japan. So that was a very surprising moment for Japan, that China was increasingly willing to use economic tools to achieve political goals. That was also the timing when China surpassed Japan as #2 in the world's GDP. Japan was also quite sensitive in terms of developing the needs to uphold the rules-based liberal international order to deal with the counter with the rise of China. So for instance, one notable example is when China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, and channeling its economic power to support the region's basically support the region's connectivity agenda. So China was strategically investing in infrastructures that is strategically important for Japan. And as early as 2015, Japan launched its Quality Infrastructure Partnership, which is based on more to uphold the rules-based approach and transparency and sustainability of economic development under these Quality Infrastructure Partnership. And now this concept is accepted by regional, not only regional partners, but also by G7 or G20 countries. And on the security front, China's rapid increase in defense spending and increasing assertiveness in the East China Sea and the exploitation of of asymmetrical capabilities, including the new domains like space and cyber, as Clyde mentioned, were also key factors for Japan to take a step ahead take more steps to enhance its security. And the second administration took significant steps to overcome some of the major historical barriers that Japan faced in terms of constitutional, legal, and operational barriers for the government and the Japanese self-defense troops to respond to the growing security concerns from China. So examples include in 2013, Japan launched its first national security strategy and also formed its first National Security Council, which aiming to enhance the interagency coordination with Japan, but also to enhance coordination with the US counterpart. And in 2014, Japan also reinterpreted the constitution to allow collective self-defense in 2014 to enhance coordination in operation with the United States. And in 2015, the landmark achievement was really the US-Japan, the United States and Japan upgraded the defense guidelines for the first time since 1996 to cooperate both in peacetime and in contingencies, such as the gray zones, and also in the new domains like cyber and space and electromagnetic fields. So since then, the two sides have been implementing measures throughout the Obama and Trump administrations according to this guideline. And Tokyo has also updated its defense strategy and procurement plans in 2018, which highlighted its increasing focus on space, new domains like space and cyber. So these were steps taken by Japan with coordination with the United States. But this comes to my second part, but the dynamics have changed after President Trump assumed office in 2017. And when he took policies, he began to retreat from multilateral institutions like the United Nations or the withdrawal from the CPTPP agreement, for instance, and pursued America First initiatives and took hardline stance on China in the strategic competition. So notable example for Japan is the launch of the diplomatic strategy called the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision, which is often perceived or associated too strongly with the Quad framework, or some people say that it is the US created this Free and Open Indo-Pacific more in the security terms, but it really came from Prime Minister Abe in 2016. And the goal was to enhance the rules-based order and transparency in governance, and also enhancing connectivity based on quality infrastructure, and also promoting regional security through capacity buildings. But the strategic meaning behind FOIP, there were other strategic important meanings to consider. First is to glue the United States and United States at a time when US was retreating from the region as well. And second was to bring in India in this regional concept. And a third is really most important is to maintain the values-based approach in regional order building to counter China's coercive and closed approach. So, and since the launch, the United States has followed, and Australia, India, and in terms of the elements of this diplomatic strategy, Southeast Asia also adopted this vision. And now UK, Germany, and Netherlands, and some European countries have also followed the need for this concept to uphold the rules-based order. And also, as I mentioned, the Quad and FOIP is a little bit different. What probably Japan tried to do also under this FOIP was reassuring the Southeast Asian countries when the Trump administration often skips this sub-region in its Indo-Pacific concept. So Prime Minister Suga's visit to Indonesia and Vietnam, for instance, as his first visits, foreign visits, amid pandemic was really a sign and political signal to send the importance of Southeast Asia in this construct. And on this, more specifically on the China challenge, just the past several years has seen Tokyo's active effort to review its tools for economic statecraft. So as I mentioned, FOIP itself is essentially more of an economic statecraft for Japan to enhance the rules-based order in trade and infrastructure building, but it also took measures to strengthen economic security to prevent the technology outflow to China. So this includes the addition of Economic Security Division within the National Security Council, which has now become the largest unit within the National Security Secretariat. And then it also enhanced the export control discussions to enhance export control and also to tighten the foreign investments. And also noting that the Trump administration's often unilateral response to sanction Chinese companies, especially in the realm of digital and critical technology fields like 5G, AI, cloud, and apps, has also affected Japan's thinking to come up with its own strategy to enhance economic security. So now finally, the differences between the Trump administration and Biden administration is that the new administration, US administration relies on and values its allies and partners in the Asia and in Europe to counter the challenges from China. So President Biden's tough stance on China, especially under the ever deteriorating security environment due to Chinese increasing assertiveness over the pandemic, was received positive and was welcomed by Japan. But for Japan, Biden's early commitment to advancing the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, and appointment of experienced Asia experts in key positions, and strong commitment to work with Japan and key regional allies through frameworks like Quad or bilateral channels, were all also reassuring and positively received and welcomed by Tokyo. It's also important to consider that since January 2021, the Suga administration's approval rate has plummeted, fallen to about 35%. And the disapproval rate now is up to 41%. And the major reason for that was the lack of leadership in managing the domestic pandemic situation. And given that there's going to be a LDP presidential election in fall, and it's very important that the United States is also trying to lead the regional construct that Japan has tried to create. And despite Biden's toughened stance and early signals to work with allies in regional global multilateral institutions, whether the Biden administration could continue to lead and remain in this region or in these multilateral institutions remain to be unseen. So there's some work that Japan also needs to, leadership role that the Suga administration also needs to continue to take. So I would finally end by raising some potential challenges or tasks for the U.S.-Japan alliance in managing the China challenges. So as I have described, and as some of the policy makers in Washington, D.C. has also began to describe the U.S.-Japan alliance as more of an equal alliance partners. That also means that there's going to be high expectations for Japan, and even more under Biden administration, which has committed to working with allies and partners. So for instance, there will be tough questions for Japan, like how Japan will be involved in any kind of contingencies in Taiwan, or how much would Japan follow the Biden administration's tough stance on China and selective decoupling? Or what about Japan? Is Japan keeping up with more on the offensive side of economic tools, like keeping up its pace in R&D and technologies? And now we see this growing debates around human rights and what kind of responses Japan will make towards human rights abuses is also one of the key questions for alliances. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuka-san. And I think I'll pick up on those points really about the alliances, because I think that they are quite fundamental to thinking about how we all fit in and how things might go from here on. Clyde, how much agreement do you think there is between the US and what one might broadly call its set of allies on dealing with China? I would mention that the sanctions that just were exchanged, which were over human rights and democracy issues rather than economic ones, were abided by the European Union and Canada, but not by Japan, or not supported by Japan, for example. Do you think we actually are capable of working together as allies, as the mantra has? Clyde?
Well, I think I've been surprised actually in the last, since Biden became president, at the extent to which the allies have stuck together. But I think, ironically, Beijing is helping the U.S. in that regard. There clearly are different degrees of willingness to face up to China. If I use Chancellor Angela Merkel as an example, and the European China investment agreement, Biden really asked the Germans and the Europeans, can't you wait for a couple of weeks? And they said no. They signed the agreement. On the other hand, I would say that Japan has, I have to give former Prime Minister Abe some credit. Japan, I think, has been quite active in developing and maintaining alliance ties in the Western Pacific and South in the region. I think that there's, of course, this tug of war between all of the major free world countries have big economic stakes in China, and people obviously are reluctant to pull away from those investments in China. On the other hand, there is this conflict with it's not even just human rights, but it's the use by China of leverage. It knows it has a lot of significance for other countries, and it uses that to discipline them. So, it gets down in pretty fundamentally to matter of free speech. You may remember about a year ago, manager of one of the American basketball teams wrote a tweet supporting protesters in Hong Kong. And immediately, basketball was no longer being shown on Chinese television. So that kind of, that really hits at the fundamental. The free world, it seems to me, really cannot accept no free speech in return for being allowed to do business in China. And I think that's the struggle that we're going to see working out over the next, 4 or 5, I hope not 10 years, but I think there's a big division here between free world values and free world business. Let me add one point to that, which is, and this is very important, US global corporations, a company like Apple, for example, in Washington, they are very powerful. They spend a lot of money. They have armies of lawyers and lobbyists. They have instant entree to the White House, to the Congress. In Beijing, they have no influence. In Beijing, they're on their knees. And so we call them American corporations, but in many respects, they actually represent China in the US political scene more than they represent the interest of the US. I think this is true to a lesser extent in Europe and in Japan as well, but because the corporations in Europe and Japan don't have quite as much influence as they do in the US, I think the US is particularly subject to this kind of corporate pressure.
Well, that's an interesting point. It takes me back to US-Japan just because somewhere on my bookshelves, I've got a book by Pat Choate, which you will remember, called Agents of Influence, which was all about Japanese corporations and their American, I feel like, customers or whatever, and their influence in Washington, which, it was comparable, but in a different strategic and security situation. Yeah. And that's interesting. Now, a couple of questions have come in that perhaps follow on from this. Nicholas McLean, which I'll ask Yuka. Nicholas McLean has asked, if the West and Japan are suffering from an increasingly assertive China, how can they most effectively stand up to the PRC, i.e. where is the PRC itself most vulnerable? Clyde has been talking about how the PRC uses other people's vulnerabilities based on their economics. And you, Yuka-san, talked about the rare earths episode 10 years ago. Where is the PRC most vulnerable, and can that be used? And perhaps as a subsidiary question, I'll add, I think as Duncan Butler has asked, in a sense, is there a difference between the Suga administration and the Abe administration on handling China, and which might be to do with that use of vulnerabilities? What do you think?
Right. So maybe talking a little more about the larger kind of diplomatic or strategic approach that China has taken. China has taken an approach to work with countries or establish relationship with countries bilaterally. And I would say that an approach to like really, if the allies can network and work together, or if you have like a multilateral grouping or institutions that can effectively challenge that, or if the multilateral institutions is strong enough to kind of counter China's effort to divide up the countries to form a bilateral countries, I would say that that would be an effective approach to that. I think one example for this is really in Southeast Asia. So Japan, the reason why Japan really supports ASEAN centrality and unity, and now around, for instance, this year, Japan is supposed to have the Japan Mekong summit, for instance. But why Japan values the Mekong region, for instance, is that the Mekong region is very close to China, and that's where China is strategically working bilaterally to kind of rip out all the countries, because if these countries and the region itself is strong enough to have resilience against China's use of economic coercion, that would be strategically challenging for China. So I think the problem right now we see is that although there are a lot of calls that like-minded countries should work together, and there has been successful visits by the Biden administration to Asia and also to Europe, there's still a lot of disagreements, especially around the very important themes that we're discussing today around technologies, between, for instance, United States and Europe on digital issues. Europe, for instance, who is seeking for digital sovereignty or its own ecosystem. So that it would be a challenge, for instance, to immediately for US and Japan and Europe to work together on these issues. But for allies and partners to come together and work together to counter this larger challenge of China is really going to be critical, and that hasn't happened yet, I would say.
Now, let me add just one thing to that, if I might, which is, interestingly, Japan is the first free world country to establish a fund to be used to essentially subsidize reshoring of Japanese corporate facilities, the production that Japanese companies now do in China. The Japanese government is offering them money to bring the production back to Japan. Biden administration, in his new $2 trillion bill that he just introduced yesterday, is trying to create the same kind of fund. And I think that is something that's very noteworthy.
That is very interesting. Yes, I hadn't noticed that in yesterday's bill. Thank you. That is interesting. I suppose, but Hiroaki Nakanishi has asked a question which I'll pop up to. We're talking a lot about how you confront China, how you exert leverage over China, how we ally with each other, and like in rebutting Chinese control. But there are things on which we have to cooperate with China. How do we do that if we want to, over climate change or post-pandemic health policy or North Korea? How do we approach that? Do you think first, Clyde, and then Yuka-san? How can we be both strong and tough on the one side and working together?
Well, I have two responses. One may sound a little bit flippant, but I think all of us can walk and chew gum at the same time. And on something like climate change, the Chinese are apparently dedicated. I mean, anybody who's spent much time in China knows that China has to be dedicated to cleaning up the environment and worried about global warming, and so are all the rest of us. So I don't really see a barrier to collaboration. But having said that, I think that this notion of collaboration with China gets expanded beyond its significance. It's really and truly the best thing that all of us and that every country can do on climate change is to take take the strongest measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in the US, we don't have to cooperate with China to reduce our own emissions. No. It'd be nice to have an agreement with China that we all set targets, but I don't see that there's a huge absolute necessity to have an agreement with China to cut emissions. The Chinese have committed to doing that. We have committed to doing that. EU has committed to doing that. And so I think it's sometimes we need to cooperate argument is, I think, made too strongly in terms of saying, well, we need to dampen the concern we have for human rights because we need to cooperate on climate change. I don't think that's really true.
Good point. Yuka, how do you think it looks from the Japanese government's point of view? The areas in which you need to interact with China.
Right. I think maybe the differences between the U.S. approach, or especially the Trump administration's approach and Japan's approach, was that, for instance, the United States has always been naming China exclusively on certain things like, banning Huawei or banning Chinese equipments, while Japan basically shares this security risks on Chinese infrastructure, for instance, but it will take a principles-based approach. And I think that this approach has, in a way, been successful in also agreeing or including China to adopt certain principles. One of the examples that was the G20, quality infrastructure principles that was agreed when Japan was the chair of the G20 Osaka summit. So that included all these elements that Japan has included in its quality infrastructure partnership, like sustainability, transparency of finance, and China has also adopted that statement. So I think how Japan is trying to create rooms for cooperation on these important areas like infrastructure, climate change, or technology is to have principles-based approach and agree with like-minded partners on these principles so that China will conform with these principles.
Clyde, there's a good question about business and business attitudes, which I know you think a lot about, and you advise a lot of them, and you write a lot in your book about them. Shiro Ota asks, is the business world generally supportive of the principle that free speech trumps business opportunities, or do they continue to lobby the government to appease China to retain economic penetration? I know my answer. I think let's have yours.
Well, it's a very good question. I would say in the U.S., I would say the corporate world is a bit of a problem for the Biden administration. Because, as I said earlier, part of it is what are the corporations themselves interested in? What do they believe in? And I would say in the US, the corporate world is divided, but it's clear that a significant part of the American corporate world is interested in making money in China. And they don't care about Uyghurs, and they don't care about Hong Kong, and they don't care about Taiwan. They want to make money. Now, that's not all of them. There are others in the corporate world who realize that China is aiming at them in the semiconductor industry and all the high-tech industries. They know China is aiming at them. On the other hand, it's a big market for them, and they need to kind of find a way to balance that. And then, of course, there are many corporate leaders who put a high value on freedom of speech and rule of law. But again, this is a place where I think the Chinese Communist Party is actually helping Biden because these actions that they're taking, really are an affront, a direct affront to the values that are held dear in democratic countries. And I think that a good way to put it is that when it comes right down to it, who are you for? Apple, for example, recently under pressure from the Chinese Communist Party, pulled an app out of their app store in Hong Kong. In the US, Apple has absolutely refused to aid the US government in any investigation of crime, which needs the opening, for example, of an iPhone. Apple will not help the US government. Well, that gets to be a very difficult place for Tim Cook to sit. And so I think that, ironically, the more China acts ideologically and the more it uses this bullying kind of leverage, the more it's going to drive the business community into a reconsideration of the relationship.
Yuka, how do you think Japanese business thinks about this? I mean, clearly, at least my kind of general impression is Japanese business has generally been more hard-headed about technological transfer and IP protection than most other nationality of business, if you like. But nevertheless, it's your business, it's your biggest trading partner. Fanuc has just announced this big investment, all sorts of people there. What do they think of decoupling plans of the government versus the need to do their business?
Right. I think decoupling is really a very important issue for Japan, and where, for instance, the United States seeks its allies to decouple from China is also something that is a big topic for Japan and what Japanese businesses are watching right now. But maybe the situation might be a little bit different from the U.S. and Japanese case. Is that Japanese, for instance, technology firms operating in China is not necessarily as high end as the U.S. Companies, for instance, and that itself is actually a big challenge for Japan. So when I mentioned my final comment about if Japan is keeping up with innovation, I think Suga, for instance, Suga administration is conducting digital policies is really the priority for Suga administration, but Japan is still focused on hardwares, and they have been very much lagging in terms of investing its workforces, but also in R&D and software side. So I think there's a little bit of a difference when we say decoupling on technology issues. But another thing I think that Japan is concerned about is really that it's really now that the Japanese government has really been starting to look seriously about the implications of the security concerns of Chinese access to Japanese technologies or Japanese companies operating in China. The establishment of Economic Security Division itself is actually the reason why, it is going to be in charge, for instance, of looking at the Japanese companies operating in China or where to decouple. They're still in the midst of outlining or deciding or defining what are the critical technologies that Japan needs to protect. And also in terms of technology outflow, Japan also needs to consider the tasks of identifying the key critical technologies in academic institutions and how to prevent technology outflow to China through academic institutions.
Interesting. Picking up on a question from Nicholas McLean about Myanmar and a question about Hong Kong, an anonymous question. The two hard cases in terms of the human rights and political scene. How, Clyde, do you think, what should be our attitude, as the UK, as the US, as Japan, to issues of freedom of Hong Kong and your friend Jimmy Lai's plight, but also Myanmar in a different place? Do we have to just simply ignore these, or what can we do practically?
Well, I think we don't ignore them, and we haven't. The U.S. has issued various statements with regard to Hong Kong and Myanmar. But as a practical matter, we have identified, we've sanctioned some officials with regard to Hong Kong. They can't come to the U.S., that kind of thing. But as a practical matter, there's not that much that the U.S. can do. However, I think these both Myanmar and particularly Hong Kong are a prelude to what really is a major question, which is Taiwan. Yeah. And up until this real crackdown in Hong Kong, it was possible to imagine that there might be eventually some kind of an arrangement between Taiwan and Beijing on a one country, two system kind of solution. I think it's no longer possible to imagine that. And so it raises the very real question then of how does the US and how does Japan and other countries in the region handle the Taiwan issue? And I think you've probably seen that the Biden administration, interestingly to me, Trump actually took the first step in establishing a much closer relationship with Taiwan than had been the case in all the previous administrations. Biden has, from my perspective, even gone a bit further than Trump. That, of course, enrages Beijing. And we've seen the swarming of boats around the Senkakus, but also in the straits and flights of military planes around Taiwan. And I think there's a real question about what do the U.S. and Japan, particularly since we are treaty allies, Australia, and we've formed, the Biden administration has put together what they call the Quad. And you know, I think a lot of people don't understand in a way the significance of Taiwan. Part of it is political, of course, but there's a very real practical significance. The biggest producer of advanced semiconductor chips in the world is TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation in Taiwan. And so when people buy an iPhone and it has a Qualcomm chip or it has an ARM chip or what have you, that's made by TSMC. It's not made by Qualcomm. It's not made by ARM. It's made by TSMC. And so this is a really strategic company. And here are the Chinese desperately trying to catch up in semiconductors. And so there has to be a great temptation for that on the Beijing side, aside from political, but technological, to bring Taiwan into the fold. I think this is going to be maybe the key issue for the next several years. It's one in which the US and Japan, I think, are very much allied. And Japan has been very, very supportive of the US. And as I said, Abe-san even took initiatives that went beyond what the US has been doing. But it's a very difficult issue.
Yuka-san, what do you think? How do you see this, how Taiwan fits into the US-Japan relationship and US and Japan strategy, Japanese strategy?
Right. It's one of the top priority topics that's always been discussed between the U.S.-Japan policy community, I think, especially for one reason that Clyde just mentioned. But Japan doesn't have Japan has maintained a non-governmental relationship with Taiwan, but the fact that the strategically important technology is produced in Taiwan also creates this new discussions about if that approach is going to continue, and maybe there needs to be some more active debates in Tokyo about how to having a more governmental relationship to coordinate these issues. And another thing that I think what's being discussed in the Japanese community right now is to prevent Taiwan from isolating from the international community. And I think COVID-19 has really revealed the potential for Taiwan to deal with these health crises and as a democratic country, and also in terms of supply chain as well, because Taiwan is so important for the IT and electronics industry. There are discussions about potentially, for instance, inviting Taiwan to join the CPTPP. And I see there's an opportunity for Japan as a chair of this year's CPTPP. UK has already applied for the membership, and Taiwan has expressed interest in applying for the membership. There could be an opportunity to engage with Taiwan on this issue. And finally, on the security front, so security and potential role of Japan in Taiwan contingencies has always been a discussion between the US-Japan policy communities. But the fact that Admiral Davison, for instance, said that Taiwan could be invaded by China in 6 years is also kind of accelerating this momentum towards the discussions between the military forces on what kind of contingency, to start the kind of contingency planning between Japan and the United States. And although it was not very clear, the recent 2+2 meeting statements also suggested that and created rooms for the two countries to start talking about this issue as a very important security concern.
Thank you. And just as a final answer, quick answer, Clyde, Nathan Rogers has answered, if China invaded or attempted to invade Taiwan, what would the US, Japan, and UK do? Would the US go to war?
Oh, that's the $64 billion question. The US doesn't have a security treaty with Taiwan. I think we don't know. I think that the nature of the game right now is kind of mutual standoff. That Taiwan, for Beijing to invade Taiwan carries substantial risks for Beijing. If Xi gave the order to go and it didn't work, that would be the end of Xi. It might be the end of the party. And while there are stories in the press about in war games, the Chinese beat the US forces in war games, that's a pretty thin basis on which to for Beijing to make a move. And secondly, it doesn't have a resistance doesn't have to be a war. China, after all, imports an awful lot of material through the Straits of Malacca, for example. One could imagine a lot of ways to make life difficult for China in the event of a takeover of Taiwan, short of actual shooting war. So I think we don't know. And in fact, that is US policy, is to maintain strategic ambiguity.
Thank you. And that is a fitting point on which to finish. Personally, I hope that we would defend Taiwan, but nevertheless, I'm not in the Pentagon. And I do recognize the difficulty or maybe the value of strategic ambiguity on this issue. US-China is the most fundamental issue surrounding both our countries, all three of our countries, Japan, the UK, and the US. And I thank Clyde Prestowitz, my old friend from Washington, getting up very early to come speak with us, and Yuka Koshino, just back from Tokyo, speaking to us from London. Thank you so much to both of you for giving us such a clear and comprehensive discussion of these issues. And thank you to the audience for attending and for all your excellent questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but there'll be more chances to discuss this issue. I'm absolutely confident. Thank you, Clyde. Thank you, Yuka. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.